Welcome, everybody. This is an exciting session. I'm ready to hear about how to staff research team for successes. I'm going to hand it over to Nick, our first speaker, and take it from there.
Thanks, Namita. So first and foremost, when we were discussing how to staff for research success during the COVID era, I wanted to give a little bit of background as to how our team here today is qualified to talk about this subject and how this subject really came about. So we are all from one of the interest groups at SAEM called the Clinical Researchers United Exchange. And back in April of 2020, we started hosting monthly COVID crux calls to brainstorm solutions to barriers that we were all facing in our research operations at our respective institutions. And this brainstorming culminated in the first research publication discussing some of the best practices and possible solutions to these challenges that we were all facing. And I've linked that publication in this QR code here on the slide if you're interested in looking it up. But what we really found throughout this process was that we had to go back to the basics when working through the challenges that we were facing. And while it might seem like a simple question to try and understand what are we working with, it really took a lot more thought and effort than previously anticipated. We really had to sit down and do a thorough resource inventory, not just of our people, but of our supplies, our PPE, our medical devices, and our medical supplies that really fueled our research. We took for granted so many resources that we had at our disposal, things like Eppendorf tubes, gloves, things of that nature were all really in short supply. And of course, with that came funding as well. We found that there were multiple tools at our disposal that might expedite or ease short supplies of these resources. Things like technological solutions like Microsoft Project Manager, which might allow us to better plan and organize our operations, were ways that we could kind of crutch and get by with some decreased inventory that we had, but it definitely wasn't necessary. What we really had to spend the majority of our time on, and what I think is paramount to begin to optimize your staffing, is to come up with a thorough assessment of needs. And while that sounds like a simple task, it really gets pretty complicated once you have to prioritize those needs and really identify your targets that your department is trying to reach and aim for. And Naomi is going to really talk a little bit more about that in strategic planning a little bit later on in our didactic. And lastly, there are going to be concerns and challenges that pop up with your staffing needs. And Jen is going to talk about some real world examples that came up during the COVID pandemic and some possible solutions and specific solutions that various institutions embraced. Really, when we're talking about how do we staff and try to optimize staffing, we really need to focus on the specific needs of our organization. And those needs are really the ones that drive staffing. Now, this is actually a picture of MGH back in April 2020, and I think it really highlights the sentiment that needs drive staffing, because while we all work in research, it's part of a larger operation and a larger mission within our hospital. And I think at a time like this, we had to take a critical step back and look at the needs of the organization, and that helped us to focus on the needs of our department so that we can optimize our staffing. So when we think about staffing needs, it's a dynamic system. Research changes all the time throughout its own life cycle. So just to try and illustrate that, here's a crude example of what someone's input might be, depending on the role, throughout the three main steps of a research project, from study concept, operations to analysis. And as we can see, there are different levels of input that are needed to execute different parts of a study. And while we can increase personnel to try and help with our staffing or decrease tasks to try and increase its efficiency, I really wanted to focus on increasing productivity, which is something that we can do really without any funding and with rather limited resources. And one of the best ways that we found to do something like that was to be transparent with your team and provide clear cut goals that were driven from the mission of your department and being transparent with targets. So I thought this was a great little tool that some departments incorporated during the pandemic to try and pass along in a transparent manner the priorities of a research group. And also it allows you to gather information about your changing population in the emergency room. So during the pandemic, the ED patient population wasn't the same as, 3, 6, 12 months prior. And utilizing a technique like this not only increases your productivity, but allows you to better understand your environment. Uh, also, uh, over at Rhode Island Hospital, I thought they came up with a really great solution of a sign-up form in which they asked a couple of really simple questions to try and keep their team on task and focused on identified targets of their department. And while while their staff were aiming at these targets, it really takes a type of global perspective on the research group in order to ensure that people are headed down the right path. And Naomi is going to talk a little bit more about how you can plan for integrating strategy into your operations for your department. And Naomi, if you'd like to take it away.
Sure. I'm Naomi Alanis, and the road to that global understanding is important because if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. I really like this lesson from the Cheshire Cat. But 3 things to keep in goal is some tasks, short term, what needs to be done this week, and long term, what needs to be done over the next year. Also, succession, what needs to be done to ensure the continuity and knowledge in your department, because institutional knowledge is key. All of these ultimately reinforce each other, and you will use your vision to guide you on this path so you can get where you're going. Also, managing up plays a role here. Again, if you have a clear direction where you need to go, you can interpolate what needs to be done. And once you get here, next slide, please. What got you here won't get you there. So you really do need to strategize. I really like this book here, The Joy of Strategy. It is the author was Senior VP of Strategic Planning and Information Management at Nick's Mass Gen, and it also comes with a handy worksheet. Here, really what I want to say is that strategy is the difference between being lost and very lost. If you have a pathway and you know your organizational goals, you have a better chance of going down that road to success. Some of the things I like to recommend is to tap into your team's hidden talents and find ways to be present with your team. Find fulfillment at home and with your work, align your priorities, manage time, get out of your own way, get out of your team's way. These activities are intense and hard, but they'll pay dividends in the long run. You can start small. SOPs are a really good place to start if you don't have any. Laying out a conceptual framework. Here I'm talking very abstract because this is not for, there's no one size fits all solution, whether you're an academic, you're a hospital site, whether you're in the community or wherever you are, you can translate and share these things with your community, not only at SAEM and with us in Crux, but with your community at your site or your hospital or whatever setting you may be in at the university. Next slide, please. Um, if you don't have a mission or charter, go get you one. Again, the mission and the organization's mission is going to drive you down the right path. You also recognize the dynamic cycle of staffing. There's going to be changes to study. Cycles are different for different studies. There are different tasks associated with that. You're going to have different enrollment goals for each one. You may have other things on your mind, but what we want to do is know your study population. If you're in a certain community, know what's out there so you can be prepared when those CROs come in asking if you want to run their clinical trial. Again, reevaluate regularly and create an expert matrix for your team. I really had fun with this one. I did this for another organization, and we learned so much about each other. It was fun. It was not like it was really bad, homework or anything like that. But one of the tasks I have here is like your hidden talents. We have people who are like Toastmasters and things like that. And we had no idea. So we put that to work, and that was something they were passionate about. Find what your team's passionate about, find what you're passionate about. I like to really link people together. That's what I like to do. This is just a suggestion. It's not exhaustive, and you can customize it to your institution. But, have a plan for cross-training and staff turnover. This expert matrix will help you do that. Have them check off what they're good at. If they happen to leave the organization, then oh my gosh, the content expert for this is leaving. What do I do? It's all right. You got a plan. So you have some time. You can work it out. I'd want to pause here for a moment and ask the audience if there's any questions or if they have any feedback, or I'd like to know what you've instituted in your organizations that could contribute and help us, because we're all trying to learn through this exchange of information. And I'll hand it off to Jen.
Thanks, Naomi. Appreciate everybody joining us today. So I'm going to talk more about the modes of implementing your strategy for staffing. You want to go to the next slide for me? So there's kind of three areas that we want to touch on. The first one is the acquisition of the staff that are going to really be the crux of your research program. Also then moving on to deployment of how those staff work and function. And then also your retention plans, or how do you deal with any turnover that you're going to have. Next slide, thanks, Nick. So acquisition, especially in this pandemic era, we have all had to get creative. And this was one of the great benefits of having a network of people at other institutions to talk about what we were dealing with. And we were able to kind of feed off of each other about how we were approaching our staffing issues during a period of hiring freezes, of staff leaving for other planned reasons, etc. And so we got creative. We looked amongst our groups, we looked at furloughed research staff from other institution areas. We looked at medical staff that didn't want to be in the clinical setting anymore to the same demands as they may have previously. We also looked at people who wanted to try something new. One of the greatest acquisitions I've made continuously over the last few years has been hiring our patient care assistants, nursing assistants from the hospital. They've got the medical knowledge, they've got a lot of patient experience, so they can talk to the patients in the department easily. And we're bringing on teaching them some of the research skills so they can do screenings and enrollments in our clinical research studies. Non-matched medical students are another great resource, especially if they're wanting to go EM, if they've changed their reasons for some reason. We know residencies are getting harder and harder, and there's inevitably going to be some of those types of students out there. And knowing that we have opportunities for those students that are, again, well-trained in a medical setting, in the medical lingo, and can get off the ground running is amazing. But staffing and networking really helps us move on to that acquisition. The deployment of our staff really means how are we going to utilize our resources? And it will totally depend on the studies that you have ongoing at your institution. In my personal institution, we actually are we have one small team that's in their own silo. They do their study and nothing else. And then we have a general pool of research staff that help support 6 to 8 other faculty members on their clinical research studies. We also have to deploy them based on their skills that are needed. That team of siloed individuals I have a specific licensure staffing level that I needed for a specific study. And they're also out in the field and on location, out at remote locations instead of just being in the department with our ED patients. Retention of our staff then becomes another final aspect that we need to look at. If you can scroll forward one for me, Nick. Keys to happy staff are really the crux of any of your retention. Flexibility has become, I think, everybody's mantra in the era of COVID. And flexibility means different things to different staff. As I've talked to colleagues across the country, some flexibility means only commuting into work 1 day a week. Some flexibility means they need to work in the evenings because they have childcare during the day that they need to tend to. It really does go to knowing your patient and maybe using that matrix that Naomi presented earlier to help show that. The benefits that you can give to your staff aren't always the financial ones, although they always help, but there are benefits to especially having staff who are going to want to grow in their career, who are going to want a letter of recommendation down the road, who want a publication, who want to be able to say they worked on a NIH-funded research study. Those are all things that you can make sure that you offer to your staff as appropriate, as well as helping their career development. Making sure that staff know, hey, I want you to learn or teach this to you because it will prepare you for the next level of your career in research. And making sure they're interested in their work becomes so very important. If they're not engaged in it, if they don't feel like what they're doing is important and meaningful, and have a personal interest to them, you're not going to get their 100% effort. The leadership from the research management team, whether or not that's the PIs, it's other residents, really has to build that relationship with your research staff, whoever they may be, because they want to have people that they can feel confident in looking towards. And then also just building that community. It was hard to build community in the era of COVID, but having a virtual happy hour once a month or so was a good way for everybody to just say, hey, it was a tough week and we made it, and way to go, everybody. And then just planning for the next part of any staffing issue, if you go to the next slide, Nick, is planning for any of those changes. So Naomi mentioned having really strong SOPs and having an inventory of responsibilities. Again, that kind of goes back to her matrix. Cross-training becomes really important, especially if you have unexpected leaves of absence or departures from your team. COVID on any given day could have been changing who staff wise was available to us because of quarantines or exposures. And so having somebody else who could pick up the ball and run was so very important. And then if you have the opportunity to have somebody train their replacement before they depart, that transfer of knowledge becomes so very important. Go to the next slide for a minute. Nick will then talk about kind of a checklist of things to think about when you walk away from our presentation today.
Thanks, Jen. So I just wanted to, we just wanted to make sure that you walk away with just an overarching summary of what we talked about in the last 20 minutes. So, first and foremost, when looking to really optimize the staffing needs of your department, you really have to sit down and take a hard look at what exactly are your needs and then prioritize them. And really, you can use the vision of your department to really drive that and assign your task priority. Also realizing that those tasks might change over time and that this might be a constant cyclical assessment. It's also really important to get a pulse on your program and to ping your employees to see what type of process improvement projects you can implement to try and optimize and make your staff more efficient. I think empowering your staff and encouraging them by informing them that they are experts at what they do and no one else spends as much time doing their tasks really allows you to gain insight that you wouldn't normally have. And that really drives innovation and optimization. Lastly, that strategic planning is going to be of the utmost importance, especially as you're identifying your short-term, long-term, and succession planning. And so we have a couple of different ideas that you can run through to try and optimize that. And lastly, to maintain symbiotic relationships with your employees. No one goes into academic medicine for the money. Everyone really has an ulterior motive there. And I'd like to think that it's altruistic in nature. And so if you can really hone on that and embrace the passion that your employees originally had when coming onto your department, I think that's really the key to making programs efficient. So thanks everyone for tuning in today. We just wanted to list our contact information. Um, we're extremely passionate about this type of work, and please don't hesitate if you're watching this in the future or next week, next month, next year. We're always happy to talk all things clinical operations and clinical research. And this QR code down in the bottom left-hand corner, if you're interested, goes to our interest group at SAM called the Clinical Researchers United Exchange. We highly recommend, if you're interested in this type of thing, to join that for further discussion. So thanks everyone for tuning in. I think we are just a minute past our time, and we really appreciate you taking the time to tune in.
Thank you so much. It was a really interesting discussion.
Thank you all so much.
Have a good evening.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you so much.